video of the closeout yesterday's show. We're now joined by Kendall Kaut, covers Baylor for SicEm365.com, also an analyst for us on 365 Sports. Kendall, correct me if I'm wrong. You were very high on this Baylor men's basketball team, as most people would or should have been. But are you flummoxed or like wondering who they can possibly turn out to be starting on Friday?
I am, Smokey. There's still a lot of questions for this team. I mean, you have a sample size of over 30 games where we know Baylor's not great defensively. On Ken Palm's system, they rank 104th. If you don't like analytics, you got a pretty easy argument. Watch the game. You know they haven't been good defensively. Same time, Adam Flagler, LJ Cryer, Deonte George, that's an incredible tandem of guards. You just feel like one of these games you're going to put it together. You hope it can be the NCAA tournament, but time really is getting late right now for him, Smokey.
Kendall, how do you feel about the draw?
Paul, I think UCSB is a pretty good team. I know you all had that good discussion with the voice of UCSB. They're excited. They have some moments where they look pretty good, but amongst 14 seeds, you lose to this one. Not really any spin zone for it, much the same way there wasn't really any spin zone to lose to Georgia State back in the day. And then Creighton is a really tough second-round matchup. Creighton ranked higher than Baylor on Ken Palm, a little bit lower on Torvik, but my guess is when that line comes out on Baylor-Creighton, if that game occurs in the second round, given Denver's a lot closer to Omaha than it is to Waco, Creighton travels well. I'm guessing Creighton's actually going to be favored by about 1.5 points in Vegas, so that's a scary second-round matchup.
Kendall, what are you looking at most deeply or looking at exactly as we head into Friday, whether it be something that UCSB does or just something that you've seen from Baylor recently that you're intrigued? For example, I mean, we know the Langston Love injury is going to remain a question until then, but is there anything about what they've been doing play-wise that you're curious about seeing coming up on Friday?
Craig, I'm kind of curious about three things. Offensively, did Baylor just decide to put UCSB in a bunch of middle pick and rolls? UCSB's center is not very quick. I watched their championship game on Monday morning, and he didn't look like a guy who could contain guys out west. I don't think he can contain Baylor's guards very effectively. Defensively, I wonder how Baylor will do with a bigger point guard. Miller is the point guard from UCSB. Not an NBA quality guy, but certainly a European basketball quality guy. He was his league player of the year. At 6'5", you go back to that UCLA game and how UCLA posted up guards so effectively. I think you worry a little bit that could they get some offensive points by posting up guards, just cutting pretty well. And the third thing I would think about with this game, Craig, is how funky does it get? If I'm UCSB, I don't want to play a traditional basketball game. Baylor has better athletes. If you're honest with yourself, Baylor has a better coaching staff as well. And so how do you get an advantage in those situations? You get a little funky. So I'm interested in what's the first kind of chess move Baylor hasn't predicted. Is that throwing out a weird zone defense? Is that having your four-man Miller, who's a really good three-point shooter, just play the 5 and give up a little bit more defensively, but say you're going to outscore Baylor? So there'll definitely be some wrinkles to this game because I don't think they'll play it just as they played most of the season.
All right, so we know who they can be when they won 10 of 11. We also have seen who they have been. And even against Marquette or the second half against KU or Kansas State. So my question is, who are they, Kendall?
Smokey, I think they are a good team, and I've written this before, a good team who is sometimes great, but is too often poor. And you really know a lot about Baylor for how long are their poor stretches. The KU game, I thought they played the best basketball they had all year for about 10 minutes in that first half, and they were just giving it to the Jayhawks now in Fieldhouse. And that second half, other than maybe the Marquette game, that was the worst I'd seen a Baylor team play in probably 3 seasons, and I was real close to the action to see kind of how it all fell apart. They are the sum of all of those parts, which means why it's so unpredictable for Baylor. I would not be shocked if I'm seeing you all and we're getting dinner together, fellas, in Houston. I would not be shocked if, even a 3-14 upset happens. I'd be surprised by that, but I wouldn't be shocked if Baylor loses to Creighton on Sunday, and I don't even, see you all in Louisville.
How would you describe this season if they don't get out of the first weekend?
I like these guys a lot, Smokey, but given, you mentioned my role is to analyze the team, it's nothing but a disappointment. And that's hard. That's a testament to Scott Drew. It's a testament to Adam Flagler and the players, the expectations at Baylor. It's not sufficient to get a 3 seed and lose in the first weekend, but it's not. This is a team with a lot of talent. This is a great coaching staff. My guess is within the next couple of years, I think John Jacobs and Al Brooks will be head coaches somewhere else. And you look back at this staff, much like the championship staff now with Jerome Peng as a part of it, and say, wow, that was an excellent staff. Unbelievable collection of guys. And then I think Adam Flagler, I think Deonte George is certainly an NBA player. So if they don't get out of that first weekend, as tough as it is, because they didn't win the Big 12, because they didn't finish second in the league, I think it's hard to say it's anything but a disappointing season. As cruel as that is, that they've risen the program to a level where a top 10 finish is disappointing. But it really is if you don't get out of that first weekend and you don't really contend for the Big 12 title the final weeks of the season either.
So what do you think has been the focus of this last week of not having to play games, which I know that losing back-to-back and getting thumped really hard by Iowa State isn't a good way to end the season, but I do think it's not the worst thing that they didn't have to play another game or so in the Big 12 tournament, given how the last 2.5 weeks of the season, 3 weeks really went.
Sure. So I think first off, obviously we know rebounding is going to be a huge deal for Baylor, Paul, with there are no ways that we talk about you can't spin the performance. 44-17, more offensive rebounds for Iowa State than total rebounds for Baylor. I know that was their focus. I talked to a couple people that I know were involved in the scout for UCSB. I know they're going all out with trying to catch every wrinkle UCSB can throw at them, be prepared for everything. I heard their flight got delayed a little bit out of Denver, so they're flying out at about 5:30 today or head to the airport around then. So I know they've really been preparing this morning. I think they're probably looking at lineup differences. I would expect Dale Bonner to get some real run here, and hopefully Langston Love can go on Friday as well. So I think it's trying to capture every wrinkle because when you're playing a 14 seed, you haven't scouted all season. Harder to know the tendencies because even the Baylor players, if they're not as in-depth for the scouting report, well, they've watched KU play maybe 10 times on their own, or they've watched Iowa State play. That's the challenge to a UCSB, that this isn't the 16 seed like Norfolk State or, I know you all love the Hartford coach, and I always love listening to John Gallagher, but Hartford was just going to get out-talented by Baylor every time they played. UCSB is out-talented by Baylor, but it's not the same degree as those 116 games. So Baylor wants to make sure they're not caught off guard by anything they might do on Friday.
So last year they got knocked out in the second round by North Carolina, who made a run. So that might have – it didn't make it easier, but at least they made the run and almost – it looked like they were going to win the national championship. Isn't it a compliment when people start to moan and groan and question, not anything about the program really, but what this team's overall accomplishment or lack of one is if you don't get out of the first round or the first weekend of the tournament? Isn't that a compliment?
Oh, it absolutely is, Smokey. I mean, 15 years ago, people were going insane that Baylor was the final 11th seed in the NCAA tournament, only to lose easily to Purdue. And now people feel disappointed if Baylor doesn't have a banner hung every year. But unfortunately, if you raise the expectations, that's what happens. I mean, same deal that when you all started 365 Radio, the expectations might have been a little lower. You're building up your audience on a new platform. Well, if you went back to what your audience was 2 years ago, you all wouldn't be happy. You haven't. You all continue to grow and thrive, which has been what's so positive. But expectations rise. Things should change. The goal is to get better. The goal is to be better. And you create big expectations. You want to win big. You have to live with the consequences of those if you don't live up to them. That can leave you pretty depressed and sad in life sometimes, but it's those expectations that also let you thrive to the level Baylor had 2 seasons ago. And I know that if in their heart of hearts, I think if you talk to Scott or the assistant coaches and the players, if you told them before the season you'll be a 3 seed, you won't win the Big 12, you get knocked out in Denver before the end of the first weekend, none of them would have accepted that offer.
Would you say that year over year now that Sweet 16 is the floor?
I think most years that should be the floor, Paul. Obviously, I think KU is the program that Baylor really kind of aspires to be, and they've been better than KU a lot over the last 4 seasons. But KU has some seasons where they've lost the first round early in Bill Self's tenure, and they've lost in the second round. But I think generally Baylor wants to be a 1 or a 2 seed every year and contend for a Big 12 title. You might have a down year where you miss on a couple guys in the portal, but I do agree, Paul, the normal outcome should be Baylor is in the second weekend about every year, kind of like Gonzaga is. And then you have those years where something comes together, especially like it did for the championship year. You win a title. But, yes, I think the expectation of Baylor is this is at least a Sweet 16 program every season. So to not make one is clearly a disappointment to the Bears.
Kendall, is Scott Drew developing the reserves as far as assistant coaching staff go? You mentioned a couple that are on staff now that could be very well head coaches in the future. He's obviously got, close to a handful developing, as far as current head coaches go. I mean, is there some reserves ready to step up and be next in line on that bench?
I think there are. Ty Beard's been the video coordinator for a long time. Really good dude. Son-in-law of John Morris. Does an excellent job. I sat through a scout before the Iowa State game last year. Really gets the guys together well. And I talked to a couple GAs when I went to the hotel to meet with Dale Bonner for an interview. And they were like, yeah, Ty really wants to get this, and this. So he's very well prepared. Tweety Carter in player development. I've talked to the players this year about how important Tweety's been to them. There are other guys on the staff that I don't know quite as well that are those rungs that are above GA but are not assistants now that I know they respect. And then just with how good Baylor's been, that's an easy system for you to bring in guys from other programs as well. So I really expect a really strong performance for Baylor staff to continue. But it's sort of the same deal. When you lose Jared Butler, you lose Davion Mitchell. You know those guys are good. That's what's tough about losing your great assistants. But good problem to have that you're so good you lose those assistants. But Jerome Tang was a loss for the Bears. And if John Jacobs or Al Brooks eventually get head jobs, that'll be a real loss for Baylor too, Craig. All
right, so who must – it's obvious Flo Thamba has to play better. It's obvious that even Jonathan Chama Chachua, even though it's a great story, him coming back, has to play better. He had a nice, surge when he first came back and then kind of leveled off a little bit just because it's hard. Langston Love is questionable because of the eye injury of whether he can even play. Who has to play better? Like, who must play better for this team to be playing in the second weekend?
I think it's Deonte George, Smokey. He's obviously going to be the highest rated draft pick for Baylor. He'll probably get picked in the top 14 and go in the lottery. We saw what he did second half Iowa State, what he did against Virginia, what he did at times against Oklahoma this season, what he's done in the first half at Allen Fieldhouse, what he did against Gonzaga. I mean, he is that guy that when he's on, there is no defense you can play against him. What I'd like to see from Key this weekend is him get into the paint a little bit more, draw some more fouls, put pressure on teams, muck up the game a little bit so that when teams get on offense, they're thinking about, man, how do we stop Deonte George and not, okay, this is exactly what I need to cut against Baylor. I think if Deonte George has a big weekend, that's the difference for Baylor. When Deonte George is playing like he played against Gonzaga, Baylor is the best team in the country. It's just a lot to ask Deonte George to be the best player in the country so many times.
And they surely didn't bring him to Waco, and they surely aren't doing what he does when it comes to the recruitment, NIL, and whatever else to be where they are right now. And so maybe he can possibly change the narrative, and Baylor can this weekend up in Denver.
That would absolutely be excellent, and that is why they brought him to Waco as well, Smokey. I mean, he didn't come to Baylor to lose in the first round. He had the option to go to Texas. Any school in the country would have taken Deonte George. I know he loves going to Baylor. I talked to him for a while in the locker room after the game, so he's going to be amped for this weekend. I know he's going to be geared up for it, so hopefully he has a big weekend.
All right. Thank you very much, Kendall. Paul, Craig. All right. Kendall Kaut. Thank you, buddy. Kendall Kaut, SicEm365.com, men's basketball analyst, and also a part of this show on 365 Sports.